With the WikiLeaks release called Marble Framework in March of 2017, the world witnessed that the deep state has the ability to disguise their cyber attacks. For instance, they can make it look like an attack came from Russia. But most people think that even if the deep state could have leaked the emails of Clinton's campaign manager, they would have had no motive to have actually done so. The logic that they parrot is that Clinton was the establishment's pick, so the deep state wouldn't leak embarrassing emails involving her campaign. They say any emails that were damaging to Clinton's campaign would have only hurt her chances at winning the election. They say exposing Podesta's dirty laundry wouldn't have provided the deep state any benefit. But what if there was a motive for the deep state to have leaked Podesta's emails, one that the media isn't telling you about? In this presentation, you'll find out what exactly the deep state would have gained by leaking Podesta's emails, why they might have been forced to do it to make sure that Hillary would be pressured into following Obama's agenda for internet governance, and how evidence suggests that they put the plan into action the very same week that Clinton announced her run for the presidency. You will also find out why the DoD's top cyber warfare game theory analyst, an MIT professor who had been instrumental in the push for Obama to give away control of the internet, was likely murdered to make sure that the plan went off without a hitch. His name was Roger Hurwitz, and he died April 18th of 2015. Hurwitz was a founder of a joint program between Harvard and MIT, which was funded by the Department of Defense through the Minerva Initiative, called Explorations in Cyber International Relations. The purpose of the Minerva Initiative is to create what's called an artificial social intelligence. The initiative is trying to produce one that's capable of intelligently tracking memes and predicting social interactions in what they call complex contagions, such as uprisings. Perhaps you heard of the Minerva Initiative in 2014 when it received mainstream coverage because some of the research being conducted involved simulations regarding the breakdown of society. Or maybe you heard about it when Facebook faced accusations of being part of the initiative when the social media titan conducted its highly controversial emotional contagion tests on unsuspecting users. The Minerva Initiative can track news stories and memes in real time to see how languages, feelings, and thoughts evolve. The principal investigator at the initiative also claims they have mapped out the entire taxonomy of the internet, meaning that they have lists, graphs, and charts of which websites and social media accounts are influential, how they interact with each other, and what political ideology each of them represents.
This is theCUBE, SiliconANGLE's Wikibon's coverage of explorations in cyber international relations. This is the fourth ECIR workshop. The conference today is really focused on cybersecurity and the governance gap. It's really the governance piece that really is getting a lot of attention. And it's our pleasure to have Nazli Shukri, who is the organizer of the conference, as well as the professor of political science at MIT and author, and very much pleased to have you here. Welcome to theCUBE.
This project is actually a collaboration with Harvard, and it's the first large-scale collaboration we've had on this kind of subject, and bringing the two cultures together was very interesting and very fruitful to do.
Tell us about this event. This is the fourth conference, right? Yeah. So tell us how it started and where it's come from.
Well, it started by us proposing a research project, responding to a request from the Department of Defense Minerva program, which at the time was intended to help boost the social sciences. And the proposal that we presented and was funded was for a 5 years analysis of the relationship between cyberspace and international relations. When we began, it looked as if these were parallel tracks. The cyber world, internet world, and the world of geopolitics, power politics, the world we know something about. And our job was to find ways of integrating both.
I'd like to welcome everybody to this event that's jointly hosted by my program. I'm the director of the information program at the OS Open Society Institute. There are roughly 3 stories that have been told in the last few years about the effects of online media, social media, new media on the public sphere, on democracy, on civic engagement. One is a kind of sunny, optimistic story There's also another story that's told that's much more pessimistic, almost dystopian. The rise of user-generated content is driving out expertise. It's a kind of occupation of the public sphere by the horde story, to caricature it. And then there are a third set of stories that are more nuanced. I guess the most prominent example would be Cass Sunstein. Our first speaker will be John Kelly, who's the founder of Morningside Analytics, and he's completing a PhD at Columbia University using innovative techniques that blend social network analysis, content analysis, and statistical analysis to create maps of online discourse and online activity in different parts of the world.
So I thought I would start out with something on screen which we have which Morningside produced for the election, which is an example of what you could call kind of a socially intelligent meme tracker. So there are a lot of meme trackers out there that essentially find out what people are talking about online in some with some amount of force, the things that a lot of bloggers are linking to, et cetera, and kind of move those up on a list so you can go and see what the blogosphere is paying attention to. Most of those, however, treat the blogosphere as kind of one haystack, and they look at what across that whole haystack is popular. And what we do is map out the way that these online public spheres are not a single haystack, they're actually a lot of different haystacks. And each haystack has its own things that it thinks are cool. And so this is an example of a socially intelligent meme tracker. In this case, this one is designed to know the difference between liberals and conservatives. And we see a space here where every dot here represents a YouTube video. And the left-right dimension is the proportion of liberal or conservative bloggers that are linking to it. And then how high it is on that graph is how many bloggers are right now linking to it right now on their front page if you went on the internet.
To see how a socially intelligent meme tracker might look in practice, here's a Minerva-funded report on the automatic detection of emerging rumors. In another Minerva-funded study titled "The Fragility of Twitter Social Networks Against Suspended Users," they study the impact of suspending so-called extremist users on Twitter. An excerpt from the abstract reads, "Since an account can be suspended in Twitter for various reasons, including spamming or spreading ideas that can lead to extremism or terrorism, we separately assess the impacts of removing apparent spam bots and apparent extremists. Experimental results demonstrate that Twitter-based network structures and content are unstable and can be highly impacted by the removal of suspended users. Further, the results exhibit regional and temporal characteristics that can be triggered by important social events. We also provide guidance on the differential impact of different types of potentially suspendable users." One of the authors of that paper, Kathleen Carley, was an author of a paper from 1994 titled "Artificial Social Intelligence." The paper laid out the theoretical framework to create a program like Minerva. Back in 1994, they didn't have the technology to make it possible, but today, they think they do. Carley is currently working on a project for Minerva that sounds like how one would describe an artificial social intelligence. Her newest project for Minerva, which runs through 2018, quote, aims to develop new dynamic statistical network techniques that support the identification of structural features in communities or nation states that can be leveraged to increase the resiliency, alter the distribution of power, support deterrence activities, or stabilize or destabilize communities. At its core, developing the socio-cultural understanding, the socio-cognitive cultural map means collecting, reasoning about, visualizing, and forecasting change in networks. However, these networks are not the traditional social networks, but rather high-dimensional dynamic inferred networks, relating actors at different levels of granularity, individuals and groups, to other actors and their activities, beliefs, and topics of concern, posing severe problems for the analyst. It continues, the algorithm, procedures, and associated tools developed in this project for identifying and visualizing SCMs, assessing resiliency and the impact of structural changes on resiliency will provide the DoD with a core operational capability to enhance predictive modeling and support mission planning. Another author of the 1994 paper that planned out an artificial social intelligence is a Cornell professor named Michael Macy. Before Obama won the election in 2008, Macy had gone to private investors in an attempt to obtain funding for a project that sounds like what Minerva came to be. Uncle Sam ultimately became the money man for the project, but here's some of the sales pitch that Macy gave to Microsoft Research in 2006.
The study of self-organization is indeed, I think, a fundamentally important area. And not just knowing how it happens, but knowing the consequences of it. In what settings does self-organization outperform socially engineered communities? And in what ways does it underperform? Studying the spread of opinion and belief, a remarkably important area where some early studies are indeed very promising. And we're going to be working on this. One of my graduate students, Tom Lento, who was just at Microsoft Research, is going to be working on this. And the idea is to see how to map the network structures of opinion polarization. Now, a lot of this work is really going to require the development of much better tools for natural language processing. But these are being developed at Cornell. Lillian Lee and her group have been working on movie reviews, and they've developed tools that are very good at giving thumbs up and thumbs down correctly on movies, and they're now moving to do the same thing for political text. And you can do this by training the machine using text from known sources. So if you know the person who wrote it, you know that they're coming from the left or the right, and then you can train the machine to pick text of unknown sources and code it left or right. So one of the really nice early studies was by Adamek and Glantz of the community structure of blogs. And what they found is a very nice result, that they found that conservative blogs tend to have higher density. They tend to link to one another, while the left-wing blogs, the blues, have more outreach. Their network structures tend to be a lower density. And this study was extended by a group in Australia, Robert Ackland's group, to political parties in Australia, to environmental groups, and to reproductive rights groups. And again and again and again, they found the same pattern, that the right wing tends to have higher density ties than the left. So there's something going on here that is going to be, I think, turn out to be a really promising area for people to continue to work. And we're looking forward to doing that with the data we're collecting from the Internet Archive. And I would like to just leave you with one idea. And actually, this idea, I think, is the one I really hope you remember and think about more than any of the things that I've told you about the Internet Archive and the research that we're doing. Because what we're doing has a hidden agenda. And the hidden agenda, I think, has more important long-term consequences. It's an agenda for social science. And it involves the development of computational social science through collaborations among social, computer, and information scientists. And the inspiration behind this comes from physics. So, what was the greatest physics department in the world in the 1960s? We all know the answer. It was Bell Labs. And one of their great accomplishments, here it is, the very first working transistor from Bell Labs. And indeed, many people thought that they figured out the transistor by deconstructing the Roswell spacecraft. That's one of the theories. They dismantled it and reverse engineered it, and that's how those things work. But actually, of course, that's not how they discovered it. It was through basic research, which they celebrated. Not applied research, not product development, but basic research. And that's what made that the greatest physics department in the world for many, many years. And so what I think we're now looking at is not just web data. What we're looking at is, I think there's going to be a Bell Labs of social science. It's going to happen. We're ready for it. And it's not just going to be social scientists. It's going to be people coming from physics who want to look at really badly behaved phenomena. They figured out electrons. Now they want to work on the really tough stuff like people. And it's going to involve applied mathematicians, graph theorists. It's going to involve computer scientists, information scientists. It's going to involve game theorists and network theorists. And what's going to happen is that the very best of these people are going to find each other in a center. Maybe it'll be called the Center for the New Science of Networks, who knows? But it's going to happen. They're going to come together. They're going to produce these collaborations, and there's going to be some really exciting social science that's going to come out of that, and network science that's going to come out of it. And what we're looking for at Cornell, and what we're pushing hard for at Cornell, is a partnership between Cornell and the National Science Foundation. And what we're looking around for is a Ma Bell-scale high-tech corporation with a strong commitment to basic science. So if anybody knows of any, please let me know, and I'll end on that.
The year before Macy spoke to Microsoft, he published The Emperor's Dilemma, a computational model of self-enforcing norms, which introduced what is known as the Contola-Macy model, a model that would be the basis of future Minerva-funded research, such as his 2016 paper titled Investigating the Observability of Complex Contagion in Empirical Social Networks, which featured contributions from a man named John Kelly. Kelly is the founder of a social media mapping company that is now known as Graphica. Kelly has also worked for the State Department. In 2012, Kelly was a moderator of a panel called Tech at State, where the head of the Government and Politics Division of Twitter, Adam Sharp, was a speaker. In 2008, Kelly explained the technology in a presentation at George Soros's Open Society Institute.
So blogosphere is kind of like a collective lens for channeling attention onto other things besides blogs, and you can map that out analytically. So we understand, we study the relationship between the blogosphere, its neighborhoods, and what it is they're focusing attention onto. We saw before the image of who's linking to Evan Prison. So there's a lot of data behind this stuff. So on the right you see a preference profile for a particular cluster of the blogosphere, and we can say, well, what is everything that they are linking to preferentially? And everything that is high up there on the y-axis going up north are things that everybody links to. That's YouTube, that's Wikipedia, et cetera. The things that end up distributed out to the right are the things that cluster of people are paying particular attention to. And so in this case, Evan Prison would be just one example of a dot out there. So that is, what you see on the left represents a single dot on the right, and then what you see on the right represents a single column of something like this. So you can create a very detailed understanding of what the preferences are for linking across this map. And that's what that is.
The Minerva Initiative was founded by the bipartisan globalist Robert Gates at the behest of Obama in 2008. Since the initiative's founding, the DoD has been using the data from Twitter, Facebook, and internet blogs to constantly track almost every news story in the world, who's talking about the stories and what they're saying, and how the interactions, linguistics, and ideas evolve over time. As you'll see, the technocrats' plan for the internet relies upon maintaining global norms so that the net doesn't splinter off due to nationalistic tensions. They say a unified internet can only be maintained if all of the stakeholders agree on what the technocrats call norms. Norms are the standards of code and internet etiquette that nation states are expected to abide by, such as what constitutes an act of war. A segregated internet could lead to the end of neoliberal reign, which is why technocrats are desperate to prevent that. The threat has been looming over the heads of the globalists since 2011, when China, Russia, and Tajikistan got together and chartered an internet code of conduct that they wanted to establish as the global set of norms. The only problem with the proposed code of conduct was that the West disagreed on a very major issue: whether damaging political information released by State A about State B constitutes a cyber attack that rises to a level of an act of war. China and Russia were convinced that it did. Back then, in 2011, the West was claiming it didn't. After the failed code of conduct to counter Russia and China's influence on internet governance, the West held a series of what were called cyber norms workshops that were run by the Minerva Initiative's Roger Hurwitz and Joseph Nye out of the Canada Centre for Global Security Studies in Toronto. The Minerva Initiative finances a joint research program between Harvard and MIT called Explorations in Cyber International Relations, or ECIR. which serves as the hub of the Minerva's operation, but the computational brain of the ECIR, the artificial intelligence laboratory that crunches the data and outputs predictions for the deep state, is located at MIT. A principal investigator at ECIR, Nazli Chukri, who also gets paid by the Council of Foreign Relations, explains how it works.
Explorations in cyber international relations, ECIR, is a collaborative joint research program between MIT and Harvard. Most of the activities and analytical work is being done at MIT, and some of the policy issues are being done at Harvard. At MIT, it involves David Clark and a bunch of others from other colleagues from CSAIL, including scholars that focus on encryption, on the security of systems, etc. Patrick Winston and others, and at the Sloan School, Stuart Madnick and those that worry about ontology, business, how we think about the evolution of realities. And then at Harvard, it's the Kennedy School, the law school, etc. So very multidisciplinary. And it's obvious when you put these people together, all of us together, we each see a piece of the elephant. Okay? And we have to agree what is the elephant. Let's assume we have an understanding of the pieces, what's the elephant as a whole. So as we built the elephant, we recognized that there was a lot of legacy from previous pieces of it, including the dominance of the private sector in constructing the internet.
Roger Hurwitz was a founder of the Explorations in Cyber International Relations Minerva project. He was their top expert on cyber norms and international escalations involving cyber attacks. His expertise in artificial intelligence is what made him valuable to the deep state because of its application to cyber war escalation game theory. His death on April 18th of 2015 was a shock to his friends and colleagues. 6 days before he died, Hillary Clinton had launched her 2016 campaign for the presidency. At first glance, the two incidents hardly seem related, other than happening the same week. But as you've seen, political dominance through monitoring and predictive analysis of the internet is essential to the continuance of the deep state. Technocrats require access to other nations and infrastructures, and that requires a unified internet. As the leaks targeting the Trump administration have shown, the deep state will go to great lengths to advance their agenda. So how does Roger Hurwitz tie in? Let's start with the cybernorms workshops that Hurwitz held. A summary of the workshops titled A Call to Cyber Norms was published shortly before his death. On page 6, it lists an update that states, in March of 2014, the U.S. Department of Commerce announced that it did not intend to renew its contract with ICANN in 2015, but to transfer it to some authority constituted by the multi-stakeholder community. In 2012, a paper by Hurwitz was published titled Depleted Trust in the Cyber Commons, which lists Hurwitz as, quote, a founder of Explorations in Cyber International Relations, a Minerva Research Initiative program. In the paper, Hurwitz argued that the US should give up control of the internet from ICANN so that other countries would be more trusting when sitting at the table to talk about global internet governance. He said, quote, the ICANN is no norms entrepreneur and lacks the political skills to leverage and reconcile competing interests among states over cyber behaviors and security. Additionally, it is seen by many states as a tool of US policy. At the end of the paper, Hurwitz concluded, India, Brazil, and South America, leading voices on cyber issues among non-aligned countries. They consequently favor transfer of authority away from the technologically oriented agencies, reflecting the multi-stakeholder model, including ICANN and IETF, to a more policy-oriented agency, possibly under the UN, though not necessarily the ITU, that gives every state an equal voice. The paper was cited in Nazli Chukri's official report for Minerva's Explorations in Cyber International Relations, where Hurwitz, was referenced 16 other times. In 2014, Hurwitz published a report titled The Play of States, Norms and Security in Cyberspace, in which he stated, neoliberal theorists observe that a state will accept international norms, although doing so involves surrendering some sovereignty to increase the predictability of the international system, an idea on which the U.S. international strategy for cyberspace relies. Roger Hurwitz's dream of America giving away the internet became a reality which he never lived to see. In October of 2016, right before the election, Obama handed control of the internet over to the UN, just like Hurwitz had called for. Giving up national sovereignty is seen as a necessity to the deep state, even if it means surrendering the First Amendment. If someone threatened their vision for the future, they would have to be dealt with. But Hurwitz seemed like a model globalist operative. He was ready for America to give up the internet just to have a hope of stability. In fact, he was a prime operative in the push to give the internet away. So why then would the deep state have started seeing Hurwitz as a threat? Why then would the deep state want a loyal, high-ranking technocrat dead? Perhaps because when Hurwitz died, he was about to publish a paper titled Keeping Cool, Steps to Avoid Conflict and Escalation in Cyberspace. In the paper, Hurwitz argued that America faced challenges in bringing Russia and China to the table in regards to global internet governance, citing differences in whether information dissemination should be considered a cyber attack. In the document, published 3 months after his death, Hurwitz said, Russia and China, per their code of conduct tabled at the UN in September 2011, would seem to include, in quote, use of force, the distribution by digital networks from State A to State B of information that State B's government considers destabilizing of its internal affairs. It continues, Western liberal democracies reject this approach, considering it a demand that a host country stifle and exile's political speech if their home country's government so requests. Just as recently as 2015, the top cyber war policy official for the DoD didn't think that what Russia was accused of in the US election would have constituted a cyber attack. Nowadays, claiming that Russia's alleged hacking of the election was an act of war is all the rage. But what if it's all just posturing by the deep state? What better way to make Russia change their tune than to accuse Russia of an act of war for disseminating information that damaged America? The deep state would have likely figured that accusing Russia of an act of war in this manner would have forced Russia to change their mind on the interpretation of the issue, and then it would bring Russia to the table with a more reasonable position, possibly one they could all agree on. That's one reason why the deep state would have wanted to leak Podesta's emails. However, subverting Russia in terms of cyber governance was probably their secondary objective. Their main goal was to get the Clinton campaign, run by John Podesta, to be concerned about global internet governance in the first place. Let me explain. According to the Podesta emails hosted at WikiLeaks, the day before Hurwitz died, the Clinton camp made a decision that would have caused much commotion within the deep state. On April 17th, 2015, the press had started to ask the Clinton camp about their position regarding the TPA Fast Track Bill of 2015. That day, Podesta made the decision that Clinton was not concerned about the passage of the TPA Fast Track, writing it off as superfluous. On April 17th, John Podesta wrote that only the TPP was the substance of the deal, and only the TPP was critical. The bill would give the executive branch the power to sign away our laws that govern how we communicate on the internet to a global consortium. On April 16th, the day that it was launched, Obama said of the legislation, quote, "It would level the playing field, give our workers a fair shot, and for the first time, include strong, fully enforceable protection for workers' rights, the environment, and a free and open internet." Essentially, without passage of the TPA Fast Track of 2015, it would have been impossible for Clinton to give away the internet to global powers, even if she had won the election. Without the TPA, there would be no global internet governance because the United States president would not have the powers to sign off on it. On April 17th, the Clinton campaign came to the conclusion that they did not care if the TPA fast track passed or not, meaning that they didn't care for the deep state's agenda on global internet governance, and they had started telling that to the press. Obama and the deep state would have heard from their friends in the press right away, even if they weren't surveilling Podesta, which they likely were. The controversy between the deep state and Clinton spilled out into the public a couple months later, with former Obama advisor David Axelrod laying into Clinton for her position regarding the TPA. Even the deep state's own news network, CNN, really tore into her.
Yesterday, she was asked a very specific question. Should a president have fast-track authority? Should the president, she wants to be president, have the authority to negotiate these deals?
The TPA is a process issue. The issue for me is what's in the deal. I think this is a chance to use this leverage so that the deal does become one that more Americans and more members of Congress can vote for.
If you're a school committee member or running for the city council, maybe that's a process question. You're running to be president of the United States of America. This is a question of what do you believe your authority should be if you win the job? Should you have this authority? Why the cop-out?
The White House seems so completely non-surprised by the way Hillary Clinton has played all of this that when given the chance repeatedly to sort of press her a little bit harder or ask for a little bit more, they say, yeah, you know what, she's running for office.
And David Axelrod even came out and called her out on this issue. So you're seeing a little bit of tension there between the White House and the Clinton, run.
Right, and because of her position, the president's been unable to twist arms up on Capitol Hill to change last week's vote because a lot of Democrats say the current leader of our party, in their view, the current leader of our party, Hillary Clinton, doesn't want us to do this.
It's John Boehner is going to save President Obama from his predicament because Hillary Clinton can't now.
Hillary's dedication to the deep state's agenda was in doubt, especially after her campaign manager, John Podesta, had taken millions in investments from the Russian government over recent years. The fact that Hillary's campaign didn't care at all about the technocrats' plan for the internet would have sent them over the edge. They would have known, right then and there, that they would need to execute a plan to keep Hillary in check. A plan that would likely kill two birds with one stone by forcing Russia to the negotiating table, along with forcing Hillary to pursue their cyber governance agenda. The only problem was that a professor named Roger Hurwitz was about to publish a paper saying that Western nations don't believe that the dissemination of damaging information from state A to state B, like Russia ended up getting accused of in 2016, is an act of war. Hurwitz's words hold weight, as he was the DoD's top cyber attack game theory expert. What he was about to publish would be the exact opposite position that Democrats thought they would need to take to coerce Russia into accepting their global cyber norms. You see, if Hurwitz was allowed to go running around claiming that what Russia got accused of was not an act of war, then the deep state cyber political posturing would have been exposed. For the deep state, this was an emergency situation. Hillary's campaign, run by John Podesta, needed to be brought to heel. With Hurwitz gone, the deep state would have no problem pretending like what Russia allegedly did was an act of war. Roger Hurwitz has not been the first person involved with this technology to die. Philip Stone, who ran a precursor to Minerva called the General Inquirer, died in 2006, leaving the project for Hurwitz to maintain. Hurwitz was Stone's colleague, neighbor, and friend, and attended his funeral, according to a news report at the time. After Stone's death, Hurwitz took over the General Inquirer project and, according to colleagues, eventually orphaned it. Hurwitz had all the email for the project going to him after Philip Stone died, and eventually, Hurwitz let the project die before he himself died. And what became the basis of Minerva's technology was invented by an artist named Mark Lombardi, whose death was ruled a suicide. But many questioned the official narrative, including the author of a book on Lombardi's death, who once interviewed Hurwitz. In the book, Hurwitz said of Lombardi, "Everyone who does social network analysis has looked at him." Today, the original inventor of the technology, Lombardi, his successor, Stone, and his successor's successor, Hurwitz, are all dead. But the Minerva Initiative is still in operation. The official Minerva DoD Twitter account is still posting anti-Trump articles. In an official Minerva brief, it states that Minerva is a department-wide effort and there is, quote, interagency coordination with sociocultural research programs at NSF, DHS, DOJ, IARPA, DARPA, and the UK Research Councils. A portion of that interagency coordination manifested itself through NSF grants CCF 1018625 and IIS 1320538, which funded such papers as Political Ideology Detection Using Recursive Neural Networks and Our Grief is Unspeakable, Measuring the Community Impact of a Tragedy, the latter of which used the Sandy Hook Massacre to conduct a study in how communities react to tragedy by mining data from Twitter around the time of the incident. The Sandy Hook study is more connected to Minerva than it first appears. One of the authors of the report, Clay Fink, is a Minerva-funded researcher on what they call social contagions. He studies the relationship between mimetic evolution and the enforcement of societal norms. Fink published a paper paid for by Minerva titled Tracking Critical Mass Outbreaks and Social Contagions, and he described their mission as, quote, using hashtags and topical tweets as the digital traces of transmitted ideas, we will test theoretical models of social contagion using this real-world data to determine if social contagions associated with mass mobilization events can be detected. Many of the influential individuals involved with the Minerva Initiative's exploration in cyber international relations have ties to Soros. Hurwitz received Soros funds through the Canada Centre for Global Security Studies. Joseph Nye, who is famous for inventing the concept of soft power, helped Hurwitz with the cyber norms workshops and also received Soros funding through Project Syndicate. Nazli Chukri, who wrote the final report for ECIR, is probably the world's top technocrat. She is tied to Soros funding through the David Rockefeller Studies Program of the Council on Foreign Relations. The CFR was instrumental in the ECIR program by funding official workshops in 2011 and again in 2014. The CFR's Adam Segal was a panel member at both the 2011 and 2014 ECIR workshops. At the 2011 workshop, Ethan Zuckerman, who is on the global board of the Open Society Foundations and runs a Soros-funded digital media research project that is very similar to Minerva called Media Cloud, gave a speech on what direction Minerva should take, and the CFR's Segal took notice of his work. The transcript of the speech was similar to Zuckerman's others. He talked about the Arab Spring and how Al Jazeera played an integral role.
Is there something special about Facebook? And my answer to that is yes and no. First of all, I would say Facebook is not in fact my preferred tool for overthrowing governments. In talking to Egyptian activists who end up going out into the streets in Tahrir, a number of them said to me, you know, I was watching it on the net, I was watching Al Jazeera stream it, I was tweeting about it, I was blogging about it. Then Mubarak shut down my internet and I couldn't watch anymore and I actually had to go in the street to see what was going on. So it's clear that that can't be a complete explanation for what goes on there. And we've got to look beyond that and we have to say, it's not that social media is irrelevant, it's not that it's responsible for the entire explanation of how people get together and protest. There's something more complicated that comes to mind. So let's try something different. I want to go back prior to Egypt. I want to study protest in the same way that we might study epidemiology. And that means we should look for patient zero. We should look for the first outbreak of the disease as it spreads throughout the Arab world, which means we have to start in Tunisia. And our guide for Tunisia is a very dear friend of mine. His name is Sami Ben Garbia. And here's the narrative that he explains Tunisia and explains the Tunisian revolution. So you guys remember that the way that Tunisia starts out is with a young man, Mohamed Bouazizi, lighting himself on fire. He immolates because his vegetable cart has been stolen. And because the policewoman who takes his vegetable cart, probably demanding a bribe, humiliates him. So he writes a suicide note to his mother, he lights himself on fire. The next day, his mother and some of his family protest on the steps of City Hall of a really small town, Sidi Bouzid. But somehow this protest starts on December 18th on this little cut-off, isolated town. And somehow, over the course of three and a half weeks, it spreads throughout the country. So that by the time we get to January 13, Ben Ali is begging for his political life, and when that doesn't work, the next day he gets in an airplane, he goes to Saudi Arabia. You have the fall of a government that had been in place for decades. What's so crazy about this is that Bouazizi is not the first guy to light himself on fire, tragically. He's not even the first vegetable seller to light himself on fire. He's not even the first vegetable seller to light himself on fire in 2010. There's a whole script for how the Tunisian government stops protest. It puts a military cordon around the town, prevents any press from getting in and out, international or domestic. International press rarely access Tunisia, but it makes it wholly impossible for anyone to get in there. They fire live ammo at protesters. Usually takes 3 or 4 days. They get the message, they go back into their houses. And that protest movement dies. So 2 years later, similar protest. Harder issue, actually, to get people psyched about. Somehow, this ends up turning into an international story and to a national movement. Here's what happens. When his family starts protesting on the steps of City Hall, they pull out mobile phones and they start documenting the protests. And they post it on Facebook. And that is key, but probably not in the way you think it is. What you're expecting me to say next is, and then it goes viral. Let me explain to you, when you ever hear a social media expert say, and then it goes viral, what that actually means is, I don't know what happens next. In this case, we actually do know what happens next. It goes up on Facebook. The people who are paying attention to what's being posted on Facebook are Tunisians in the diaspora. They're running websites like a website called Nawat. And Nawat is basically aggregating and curating what's coming out of the social media. It's going into Facebook, it's grabbing these videos, it's putting them together on a timeline, it's translating them. In the media world, we would say it's packaging them. And it's packaging them because it's hoping that someone is going to pick up the story. And someone does. The someone who does is Al Jazeera. And we start pulling this apart, what we start realizing is that thinking about social media by itself, simply as a way to get information out there, is probably inadequate. What we have to do is start thinking about an ecosystem. We have to start thinking about this idea that what participatory media does is makes it possible for people to create media at very, very low cost. And then if they're able to use that sort of complicated network, it's possible sometimes, and not always, to get that media out and get it amplified to the point where it reaches enough people that you're able to have a coordinating function, where people in a nation like Tunisia are able to say, wow, we've never seen this before. We've seen people stand up before, and we've seen these movements rise and fall and go away within 2 or 3 days. But the fact that people are still protesting after a week, and the fact that it's spreading from one town to another, that's unprecedented. And this is something that I want to be a part of. And that's how it moves from involving a small number of people in a small town to being capable of taking down a government.
A few interesting notes on Zuckerman. One, he's gone on record saying that he was friends with the organizer of Egypt's Tahrir Square protest that led to the downfall of President Mubarak and the Arab Spring.
And as I take the stage to talk to you, I'm profoundly aware of the fact that my friend Alaa Abdel Fattah, who's one of the organizers of the Tahrir protests, is currently in military prison in Cairo for protesting against the military government that he helped, unfortunately, bring into place.
He's also claimed to be friends with the late Aaron Swartz, the co-founder of Reddit, who was trying to disseminate the JSTOR papers involving Minerva Initiative reports at the time of his death.
By admitting that I was friends with Aaron Swartz, the young man who committed suicide after being prosecuted by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And MIT not only didn't fight that prosecution, but in many ways sort of actively encouraged it.
Swartz was a free speech advocate who would have never allowed Reddit to be used for social engineering or technocratic experimentation.
One of the projects that I love to teach is this visualization called They Rule. and it looks at the interlocking directorships of different Fortune 500 corporations and different nonprofit organizations. And the whole rhetoric of this is, if you just look, you can find the secret people who actually rule the world. And when I teach this, of course, I then swing over and then I show where I show up on the map as a board member of a large foundation, the Open Society Foundation, and essentially say, great, okay, guilt by association. I am now part of the ruling elite. You know, the transparency of sort of showing who's involved with this doesn't actually help when our paranoid theory is that a small number of people actually rule and control the world.
Zuckerman also claims to be a friend of Lawrence Lessig, the Democrat who ran for president in 2016.
If you don't trust institutions in making change through them, if revolution looks dangerous and ineffective, we're left with this question of efficacy. How can you actually go out and try to make lasting change in the world today? Here's one of the things that gives me hope. My friend Larry Lessig wrote a book in 2000 called Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. And he meant this as a lesson in how people regulate new technologies. We can make technologies legal or illegal. We can make them cheap or expensive. We can lock down the code so that you can't do certain things. You can't rip the DVD in your laptop. We have social norms that say that certain things are acceptable or unacceptable. And these are all ways that we control technologies, for better or for worse.
After his failed campaign, Lessig organized the Hamilton Electors Movement, which sought to have Trump replaced with a different Republican via the Electoral College. Lessig's model of attaining power without enforcing laws seems to be the favored method of today's Democrats, who have all but given up on passing legislation. Instead, they prefer ideological enforcement through cultural norms, think social justice warriors, through code, think Twitter throttling and Google News placement, and through markets, think Tesla. Zuckerman provides evidence that the Black Lives Matter movement might have ties to Minerva.
So here are some of the hard questions that I want to ask. We have a lot of conversations at MIT within the Center for Civic Media where we try to figure out how to read a particular protest or a particular tactic. And one of the ways that we've started taking this on is using this matrix. And these are very rough categories. These are, not binary categories, but I'm going to try to play with them because I found them very helpful in sort of thinking about this space. We put up one axis of thick and thin. And what I mean by that is there are types of civic engagement that basically ask you to show up, but they tell you what to do. When you are told, we need you to sign this petition, we need you to donate $10 to the Red Cross, that is generally speaking a fairly thin form of engagement. A thick form of civic engagement essentially says, we want your creativity, we want your strategic mind, we want you as a media maker, we want you to think about how you help us solve this problem. And thick activism is very, very challenging. It's a much more difficult space to work in. But I'm also finding that it's a space that many people want to work in. And they get very frustrated when the ask is a thin ask of one fashion or another. The second axis, this is one that I get in trouble from, but I'm going to get in trouble for a lot of things around this talk, so we'll just go for it, is basically going from symbolic to impactful. And what I mean from that is that there are ways to take action where it's primarily about voice. It's primarily about making a statement. It's primarily about articulating your position and your identity on an issue. And there's also ways to go after impact, which is to say, I see a way to make change in the world, and I see a pathway towards that change. And so we've started to try to think about different forms of activism within this 2x2 matrix. So let's start with one of the most popular, and frankly, one of the better critiques of online activism. Evgeny Morozov has a new book coming out. One of the themes that connects it to his last book is this idea of either collectivism or slacktivism. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to criticize certain parts of civic engagement and certain parts of activism as being slacktivism or collectivism. It's a way of saying that that's both thin and symbolic. If you manage to get it to a large enough scale, it might have very powerful impact in saying 1 million people clicked on this, 1 million people tried to call attention to this, but the danger is that this can be a very lightweight form of engagement in one fashion or another. Now, being thin is not necessarily a bad thing. Lord knows I'd love to be a little thinner. But when you think about something like voting, voting is necessarily a thin form of engagement. When voting gets thick, that's when we bring it into the Supreme Court and essentially saying you're putting up unconstitutional barriers to vote. And you could certainly make the case that the momentum for immigration reform in the US at the moment demonstrates that simply showing up to vote and having a lot of Latinos show up to vote can have enormous impact through a fairly thin act of showing up and saying, hey, we've got political power, you need to start thinking about where we go. Another controversial statement. When people talk about Occupy and when they critique it, a lot of that critique is based around the notion that Occupy was thick but largely symbolic, which is to say, very few people want to deny the fact that people put an enormous amount of time and energy, personal risk into showing up at encampments to try to build governance systems. But you can make the argument that in many cases the impact was more calling attention to the notion of inequality rather than trying to move a specific lever of change to try to pass legislation, to try to oust powerful institutions. Again, open to the critique that this is an oversimplification of it. In many ways, I would actually point to something like Occupy Sandy as a great example of where something gets thick and extremely impactful, where you had very experienced occupiers in Brooklyn saying, look, we see a way in which we can take what we've learned from occupation and we can put it towards a problem that right now the federal government is not doing a particularly good job of solving. We can solicit goods and we can figure out how to bring them out to people who really need them. Now, what's interesting is that when you start playing in this space of efforts that are impactful and thick, they clearly have an influence on the people that they're trying to help. They clearly are leading to some sort of change. They're inviting your creativity, they're inviting your strategic mind, they're inviting your full participation. We often discover that they're working at very small scales. And this is really challenging because this is the part of the graph that we'd like to be in. We'd like to be impactful, we'd like to be thick, we'd like to recognize people's creativity, we'd like to make sure that what they're doing has a change in the world. And we'd also like to help them figure out, can we do it not just in one neighborhood, can we do it at the sort of scale to transform the problems that the nation as a whole is having. So this is how I'm starting to look at this. I'm interested in that bottom right-hand corner. I want, in my activism, in the social change work that I'm doing, I want to be impactful, thick, and at scale, and I want to try to help people figure out how to get there. And a lot of what I'm trying to work through at the moment is figuring out how do we move into that very difficult quadrant.
To get into that lower right quadrant, they went with the tried and true formula. Remember, the Tunisian Revolution, where the Arab Spring began, started with police protests.
And because the policewoman who takes his vegetable cart, probably demanding a bribe, humiliates him.
Zuckerman has pointed out that the Tahrir Square protests in Egypt, which ousted Mubarak, also began by protesting the police.
It actually doesn't help us very much with Tahrir, because those protests start taking place on Police Day. And of course, it's good to remember that the Tahrir protests start with protests against police brutality, but they're scheduled for January 5th for Police Day.
Black Lives Matter was just a copycat of the Arab Spring, and Zuckerman promoted it at a conference for journalists in 2016, in which he instructed the journalists to give up any air of being non-biased and to instead become overtly progressive activists.
A lot of my work is around this idea that some of the most powerful change that we make is through social norms. So one of the things that's happening in the United States is that unfortunately our police shoot a lot of people. And in particular, they shoot a disproportionate number of black people. And this is not a matter of law. It has been illegal to shoot people for a whole long time in the United States. It's been illegal to shoot black people for at least 100 years or so. We don't need particularly new laws around this. What we do need is a set of social norms. The media ended up using a particular mugshot for him. They took this image over to your left off of his Facebook page. Now, what does Mike Brown look like in this image? Just shout something out. What do you see about Mike Brown? How does he look? Yeah, he looks like a thug. He looks tough. Why does he look like a thug? What in that photo is making him look so tough? He's shot from below, which makes him look taller, it makes him look bigger. This is a Facebook photo. This is an 18-year-old kid. Of course he wants to look tough. I want to look tough. So he's put this photo up there to make himself look as badass as possible. And this is the photo the media has grabbed to discuss Michael Brown. This is another picture of Michael Brown taken around the same time. What does Michael Brown look like in this photo? He's sweet. He's a baby. He's got these baby cheeks. He's a cute kid. He's a nice kid. And that's a very, very different image of who this young man is. So activists looked at this disparity and said, let's go into our Facebook feeds. Let's find the photo that makes us look at our worst and the photo that makes us look at our best. And you look at this young man here, and in one of those photos, he looks like a guy you don't want to mess with. In the other photo, this looks like a man who you very much want to celebrate about what's best about America. And over the course of 3 days, this turned into a national campaign of people taking this on, writing essays about it, writing about why they wanted to participate in it. Within 3 days, this was on the front page of the New York Times. And more importantly, it's very hard to find that first photo of Mike Brown anymore. You simply don't see it. Media got the point. They got the point that the way that we portray these victims of police violence has a lot to do with our norms about whether we see black men and boys as dangerous or not.
At the end of the speech, a woman in the crowd asked Zuckerman to spell it out for her.
Do you want journalists to kind of like spell out what people could do? Or do you want to see whatever arises, like let's say Black Lives Matter, and then make the link?
So, first of all, I think the experiment The Guardian tried was very, very interesting. Instead of asking this question about, are there moments where you actually want to cross the line and become advocates? And I think there are cases where that's the appropriate thing to do. I think climate change is a particularly good one in as much as the science is settled. And really at this point it's a question about how you do it well. But I would also point to amazing people in the audience like David Bornstein, who have really been working on this question of solutions journalism and featuring the best solutions. And part of what I'm essentially saying is that I think a lot of the really interesting solutions around things like norms are coming out of activist moments. They're coming out of these movements. And so I think if we're going to report on something like police violence, then linking it into something like Black Lives Matter and telling people how that movement works, how people are building on it, where to go, I actually think that's very important.
Zuckerman even went so far as to tell the journalists that becoming progressive activists is the only way to save journalism.
But if you are working on a movement like Black Lives Matter, and your goal is to change the social norm, this is some pretty good evidence that those sorts of campaigns can work, and that they can work by modifying media and changing what we pay attention to. So I want to ask us to think about these things. Think about, can we communicate how power works now? Not just in terms of politics and law, but in terms of markets, in terms of technologies, in terms of social norms. Celebrate the successes of people who are doing this work well. And then finally, as Alan made the case, figure out how we link these stories to meaningful action. So many of us have written stories where we've ended up saying, now that you know about this, please take action. Write to your senator or congressman. Sign this petition. Stop doing that. For the insurrectionists, that doesn't work. That's a signal that you're not serious. Think about the other changes people are trying to make. Think about things that people are trying to do in markets, with code, with norms. Think about how we link people to those actions as well as to the legal actions. So I want to end with this idea. I don't think it's the public's job to save journalism, but I do think it's journalism's job to help save civics. I think we have to figure out how these changes are taking place. And whether we reach out to the institutionalists and say it's time to make those institutions stronger and better than they ever were before, or whether, and this is what I'm urging you, we reach out to those insurrectionists and say, we hear you, we know why you feel powerless, we want to help you become powerful. If we can figure out how to save civics, how to get more people who are alienated, deeply engaged with this, that's the first step towards saving journalism.
But Zuckerman doesn't really care about saving journalism. He only cares about saving progressive journalism.
The constructive journalism is very well focused on more or less left-wing issues. Do you see a future for right-wing journalism like Fox or Breitbart?
So I think Fox and Breitbart have this stuff down.
Zuckerman elaborated on his election sentiments in a speech wherein he revealed that he has been part of an 18-month study involving the parsing of every news story about the 2016 election.
So, I think like a lot of people last week, I spent a lot of time comforting people. I had a lot of people show up in my office really wanting to talk through things. I expected to be wiping up some tears. I didn't expect to be wiping them off the faces of fellow faculty. Where I was trying to go after, I think, helping people try to see some light spots in all of this, and by the way, the quick light spot version of this goes, if you'd had 1 out of 100 Trump voters vote for Clinton, tiny amount, we would be talking about a historic moment with our first female president, and we would be completely ignoring all the hateful, racist, xenophobic, misogynist bullshit that's been brought up by all of this. And so the good news is that we have no excuse to ignore, and we actually get to work on it. You had our classically neutral, just the facts press completely step down from that and say, you know what, we're getting into the fray, we're rolling up. Everybody endorsing one candidate. Editorial pages coming out and essentially saying the other candidate is a threat to our very existence. And it didn't matter. We're doing some work with Yochai Benkler around this platform we have called Media Cloud that has been gathering every story in English language media about the election for the last 18 months. And we've done some preliminary graphs. We're a couple months before we're actually going to publish this. But the preliminary graphs are fascinating. They cluster into 2 clusters. Now, you were all guessing that. What you're not guessing is what's in the clusters. In one of the clusters is, you know, the New York Times, The Nation, Mother Jones, the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, Reason Magazine, anything you can think of as far as mainstream media on the left and on the right. That's one cluster. There's another cluster. It's got Breitbart, and it's got 4,000 things around it you've never heard of. So we actually watched the birth of a new media sphere, and we watched it be enormously influential in all of this.
Zuckerman collaborates on media research with Al Jazeera employees through the Qatar Computing Research Institute. It's no coincidence that networks such as CNN have moved to copy the tactics of fomenting revolution from Al Jazeera. Zuckerman has inside connections at CNN, where he is occasionally featured as a columnist. I've covered how the Newtown shootings were used as the basis of a study funded by the National Science Foundation and connected to Minerva through Clayton Fink. But right after the shooting, Ethan Zuckerman wrote a column for CNN saying that people should not worry about politicizing the issue, and quote, moments of crisis like the shooting in Newtown tend to produce brief spikes of popular interest in gun control. My research on media attention suggests these spikes are extremely short-lived and that they may be decreasing in intensity. There was less popular interest in gun control as measured by Google searches after the Gabrielle Gifford shooting and the Aurora killings than after Virginia Tech. And then, just months before the Arab Spring started, on July 8, 2010, Ethan Zuckerman was a panelist at an event to talk about the ability of the internet to foment revolution. One of the other 2 panelists was a representative from the State Department. The event was held by the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is funded by Congress.
So one of the things to recognize is guess what? If we don't engage, then what we're doing is we are ceding the field in its entirety to extremist organizations like Hezbollah. So, first of all, recognizing that young people the world around are already using these tools and recognizing that we therefore have an imperative to use them and harness them for good is step one. And I give Secretary Clinton a lot of credit for recognizing that very early on and saying we can't stand on the sidelines.
Hillary Clinton had been used by the technocrats while she was the Secretary of State to give an internet freedom speech, a speech which apparently the deep state later conceded was a mistake. According to an official summary of the panel hosted at the ECIR website and accessed through Google's crawler, they said, quote, "After WikiLeaks, we had to calibrate Hillary Clinton's internet freedom vision." In 2011, Secretary Clinton gave a revised internet freedom speech.
There is a debate currently underway in some circles about whether the internet is a force for liberation or repression. But I think that debate is largely beside the point. Egypt isn't inspiring people because they communicated using Twitter. It is inspiring because people came together and persisted in demanding a better future.
5 months after the election, Hillary Clinton blamed weaponized information for her defeat. The deep state again has control of Clinton, forcing her to push their internet agenda.